Yo, what's good YouTube? It's your host HDSim right here, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're bringing y'all a new what if, this being the what if movie to what if Deku had Mahito's abilities. Thank y'all so much for tuning into this what if, and thank you to the person who commented down this video as I checked out your comments, so here's the video. Hopefully you enjoy, as well as everyone else. Now with that being said guys, I do have to announce something before we get started with this what if. This being the fact that unfortunately after making this what if, I will have to go on another break. And the main reason for this one is because of the fact that I have exams coming up and I really want to dedicate myself into studying so that way I can pass the exam. So yeah, this entire time after making this what if, I'll be on break. But don't worry, once I end up finishing the exam, I will end up returning back and going back to my regular schedule. In the meantime, while I'm gone, you guys can actually end up commenting down your own what if ideas, as I'll make sure to check them out and potentially end up making them in the future. We'll see. But yeah guys, with that being said, I don't really got much else to announce, so with that being said, it's your host HDSim right here, and let's get started.
You're never gonna make it, you're not good enough. There's a million other people with the same stuff. You really think you're different? Man, you must be kidding. Think you're gonna hit it, but you just don't get it. It's impossible, it's not probable, you're irresponsible. Too many obstacles, you gotta stop it, yo. You gotta take it slow, you can't be a pro. Don't waste your time no more. Who the fuck are you to tell me what to do?
To begin the what if, let's start with Deku's origins. When Deku was born into the world of My Hero, he actually starts off with a bunch of stitches all around his body, which ends up surprising everyone around him. However, luckily after an examination, they end up coming to the conclusion that Deku only unlocked his quirk at an early age, which is the reason why his appearance looked like that. So after making sure that Deku was alright and that there was nothing life-threatening to him, they end up giving him to Inko, as after that she ends up going about raising him. Now this will continue on all the way to the point where Deku ended up going to school, as during the time Deku would actually be pretty popular in the very beginning. As after all, with his cool appearance, as at least that's what most kids saw, and also because of the fact that he already unlocked his quirk at an early age, many people envied Deku, with one of them being Bakugo. And this will go on for quite a while, all the way until eventually that will come to an end, as Bakugo ends up unlocking his own quirk. And you see, this ends up changing Bakugo, but not for the better. Because you see, after unlocking his quirk, Bakugo begins to be so arrogant, as he begins to gain a large amount of praise and respect from everyone around him, that causes him to pretty much look down on everyone, especially Deku. And you see, this begins to go on for quite a while, until sooner or later everyone else begins to unlock their own quirks, as it was finally about that age that everyone finally unlocks their own quirks. As one by one people begin to unlock their quirks and show off how cool their abilities were, eventually people begin to take notice of Deku and realize that his quirk really wasn't all that cool. I mean, there were some people that had their own mutation quirks and they were way cooler than Deku's. As in their own standards, Deku's quirk begins to seem less and less impressive as more and more people begin to gain and acquire their own quirks, as this begins to label Deku kind of the weakling of the class, or heck even known as the freak, as that's what Bakugo called him. As after all the kids end up unlocking their own quirks, but each one of them getting like these cool different quirks that have these different abilities, Deku's quirk begins to look just completely worthless, which actually ends up giving him the title known as Deku from Bakugo. But you see, even though he was in front of all these taunts and jeers from everyone in his class, Deku did not rise to the challenge. He did not fight back against any of them, and in fact, he let the comments just slide off his back. As you see, while everyone else was just maturing to become even more childish, Deku was actually maturing for the better, as he begins to actually learn to let it roll off his back, not let it bother him, and honestly just focus more on his future. As to be honest, Deku had quite a few ideas in the future, as he even thinks about becoming a hero, but he's also trying to find out exactly what type of hero he wants to be. Although Deku is not 100% sure on what exactly his goals are, he knows that he's going to be working hard to achieve any of them in the future, as that's exactly what Deku does. As for the meantime, he's currently right now at the top of his class, and not only that, but basically all around he's doing perfectly well for the entire school year. But you see, then there will be a following day that things will then change. Because you see, Deku's goal will then finally be formed, and it'll be thanks to this very certain day as we now turn to it. Because you see, on a certain day, we end up seeing Deku currently right now going through a small little math problem that he formed in his notebook. And right now he was just simply enjoying solving the math problem until eventually he will be approached by Bakugo and his lackeys, as they proceed to do the same song and dance routine of making fun of Deku and pretty much everything that he was doing. But you see, Deku just simply ignored them, as that was the regular routine for him. Until eventually Bakugo then decides to actually destroy Deku's paper, as he begins to ask Deku what exactly he's doing, as after all, Deku's not paying attention to him. But Deku once again ignores Bakugo, saying that everything he's doing up to this point has just been childish, and pretty much just tells Bakugo that he's nothing more but a joke. And this infuriates Bakugo as he approaches Deku and attacks him, and Deku ends up being surprised at this, since although Bakugo does end up getting violent, most of the time it's on the surrounding objects, never onto him, as this ends up causing a reaction from Deku, as this will actually be thanks to Deku's ability or his quirk. Cause you see, unknowingly to Deku, when Bakugo had actually ended up attacking Deku actually decided to find a way of self-defense. But not only he didn't do it with his hands, instead he literally manipulated his own soul, as he did it on pure instinct. As just as Bakugo was about to land the attack on Deku, this is when he reels back in shock as he ends up crawling away and screaming in pure terror. As the main reason for this one is because of the fact that Deku's appearance wouldn't change, as his face will look very disturbing, as the stitch marks that were on his face will actually open up as Deku begins to show off a very demonic looking appearance, as it will look very terrifying for a young child. Now this not only ends up terrifying Bakugo, but this also ends up terrifying his lackeys and everyone else in the class, as they end up looking at Deku's appearance in pure horror. Now eventually Deku ends up looking around seeing everyone's expressions, as he ends up reverting back to normal, asking them what was going on. But of course, after seeing their appearance and seeing how terrified they were, Deku actually begins to laugh a little bit because, after all, he's still a child. But just as Deku was laughing, this is when suddenly Bakugo begins to call Deku a freak. Now you see, hearing this, Deku really isn't offended at all, since, after all, this is not the first time that Bakugo had called him that. But this is when, one by one, every kid begins to follow along, as they begin to throw just completely rude comments at Deku. As now, this was not any bullying or taunting, no, this was just straight up insulting at this point, as they were literally throwing as many insults as possible at Deku, as they were really terrified of him. As the main one that really stuck out was Monster. And Deku, after hearing this comment, was very offended, as he couldn't really let that comment just roll off his back. As he didn't actually ask the person what exactly he meant, this was suddenly Bakugo would then get up, as he didn't tell Deku that he's a freak and a monster, as he didn't tell Deku that someone with a quirk like his can never become a hero, that Deku was actually better off to be a villain. Now this ends up actually striking a chord with Deku, as this is when suddenly one by one kids begin to agree with what Bakugo had said, as they begin to call Deku a monster, a freak, and a villain. And hearing all these comments, Deku will be even more surprised by all of this, as he couldn't believe just how cruel they really were. As he couldn't believe that they actually thought that because of a quirk, Deku would be better off as a villain. It made no sense. Deku had tried to argue back, saying that it didn't matter what quirk they had, as after all, anyone could become a hero, but these were kids after all. They were like a hive mind. After all, if one person believed something, all of them believed something. So thanks to that, Deku was pretty much dubbed by all of them as a future villain in the making, which Deku just found plain ridiculous. As after that following day, Deku ended up returning back home and being silent for the rest of the time, making Inko worried. As Deku ends up laying in bed, thinking over on everything, this will be the moment where Deku actually ended up discovering a goal. As Deku's goal would actually end up becoming the fact that he would end up changing the way that people end up viewing quirks, as it didn't matter what type of quirk you have, you always had the potential to become a hero. As with that thought in mind, Deku would immediately begin working on it, as this is where we now do a time skip. As after that following day, we actually end up seeing Deku grow up pretty well actually. I mean, besides the bad reputation and isolation. As after that day that Deku had, transformed his appearance and used his quirk for the first time, bad rumors began to spread around him, pretty much making him to be an evil individual that will definitely end up becoming a villain in the future. With Bakugo being the one to really kind of gain success because of this, as he pretty much rest assured everyone that he will keep Deku in check, pretty much trying to make himself look like the hero. Even though he was the one who was, deeply afraid of Deku and was the first one to really fall to the ground in fear. But still nonetheless, let's move on. As we end up seeing Deku throughout the many years that went by putting the isolation to good use, as he uses that opportunity to train his mind and also his quirk. As thanks to this, Deku once again reigns supreme at the top of the class, with Bakugo being a close second. Not only that, but Deku begins to get more and more uses out of his quirk, as he begins to actually truly master it. As Deku realizes that he can pretty much manipulate everything about his body, and I mean everything about it. He can literally change how tall he is, how short he is, he can make himself super strong, he can make himself look like an athlete, he can pretty much do anything. And the craziest thing is the fact that it doesn't even have to be necessarily human either, as Deku can literally change his appearance to that of an animal as well. He can change from being a cat, or he can change to being a whole ass shark. He can pretty much do really anything with his body, and it was an amazing experience, although it was one that was very confusing to do, as after all, Deku had to read a lot of books, and honestly, he had to read things that like literally doctors do, which already ended up giving Deku many ideas, not only for his hero name, but also for any future backup plans that he may have, as after all, if the hero thing doesn't work out, Deku can just simply become a doctor with his quirk. But moving on. Now, we end up turning back to the present as we see Deku sitting down in the back of the class as he'll be listening to music. Now you see, similar events like the main timeline will play out as the teacher will then enter, begin to announce to everyone that he already knows that they want to become heroes, announce the UA entrance exams, which Bakugo begins to announce that he's going to pass it and become better than All Might, and that's when the teacher then announces that Deku also has a shot, surprising everyone. Now Bakugo, hearing this, would immediately begin to get upset as he pretty much tries to threaten Deku, but you see, Deku just simply ignores Bakugo and just tells him to go away since he was too busy listening to music. This ends up pissing off Bakugo greatly as he then tries to attack Deku, but right before he does, this is when Deku then suddenly ends up sneezing. And this will end up leading to a very disgusting sight as Bakugo will then be covered in a ginormous amount of snot, looking straight out of a cartoon, which ends up causing Bakugo to immediately begin to scream out of disgust as he tries to rub it off of him, all the while Deku begins to laugh and giggle. Eventually the bell will then ring as Deku will then leave the class, picking up his notebook and everything as he leaves the area, all the while Bakugo will be throwing out as much curses as possible. Cause you see, after the many years of growing up, Deku has kind of learned how to deal with everyone that may bully him, and I mean especially Bakugo. As Deku realized now that he didn't want to go around and just simply beat them up as it just simply didn't seem right. No, he would do that to the villains. No, instead Deku decided to do something way better, and that being that Deku became the absolute troll of the entire school. Like legit, if you try to bully Deku or really do anything about that, not only will he pretty much make you look like a clown in front of everyone, but basically he will make you so embarrassed to the point where you don't even want to show yourself at school. And I mean, the only person who really ends up going after Deku, even though many of them already know what he's about to do to them, is really Bakugo, considering the fact that instead of being humiliated, to which, I mean, he still is, but instead of really letting the humiliation get to him, he only makes it fester his anger towards Deku and pretty much swears revenge on him pretty much. Not like it was really gonna ever happen, as we now continue on with the story. Now we see Deku end up taking the same path like he did in the main timeline, as after escaping Bakugo, he ends up going underneath the bridge to take a path back home. But on his way home, he ends up encountering the sludge villain, as he looks at Deku and tries to ask him if he can borrow his body, to which Deku ends up telling him no, and also telling him that he really needs to phrase that better. But unfortunately, the slug villain does not listen to Deku and instead just attacks him. But unfortunately, that doesn't work, as Deku is not some ordinary kid. As right before the slug villain's eyes, Deku ends up disappearing, as right before he can wonder where he was, this is when suddenly Deku ends up putting a hand on the slug villain's stomach. Now this ends up catching him off guard, but he tries to attack Deku once again, only to be surprised as forcibly his appearance will then be altered, as Deku have a look of deep concentration. As right before our eyes, we will then see the man's body then be forcibly reverted back to that of a human, as now the man was back to his normal human appearance. Now this will catch the man off guard, but he tries to activate his quirk once again, but this time when he does it, he feels an extraordinary amount of pain of the likes he never felt before begin to go through him as he immediately stops. Now he ends up panting as he tries to do it again, but this time it's even worse as he then stops as he looks at Deku before questioning him about what he did. However, instead of answering, Deku would be instead laughing as he begins to giggle, amazed by the fact that what he just accomplished, as he begins to mutter over and over again that he did it, that he couldn't believe that it actually worked. Now the sludge villain begins to actually shake Deku, asking what he did angrily, but before he can go any further, this is when Deku would then give him a dead serious expression. Opposite to the kid before, who seemed to be nothing more but a smug little brat, but now instead it seems as if Deku was something else, something more terrifying. As this is when the villain really begins to take a notice of Deku's appearance, as he realizes just how terrifying this kid truly was. As this is when Deku then tells him to think wisely of his next choice. Now just as the villain was actually about to, take back about what he had just done, this is when All Might would then arrive on the scene, and seeing the villain there holding up Deku, he immediately begins to go into action as he knocks out the villain in one blow. Now after that, All Might would then soon make sure that Deku was alright, and of course signing his notebook and everything, pretty much acting like the same way he does in canon. Except the thing is, All Might's a little bit unnerved here. Cause you see, instead of Deku being all fanboyish and everything, Deku just looks at All Might with a analytic gaze. Before suddenly he just ends up picking up his notebook, thanking All Might for his time, as he then leaves. Now All Might would think that Deku was a little bit weird, but still nonetheless took the villain away, as after all he needed to make sure that this villain was put to jail. All while unknown to All Might was the fact that while Deku was walking away, he already put the notebook that All Might had signed in back into his backpack, as he then pulled out another one. As in this notebook, Deku was writing notes about his quirk. As you see, the thing is, there's not been a real proper name for it, and not only that, but the information about Deku's quirk is pretty much unknown. As this is when Deku then opens up his notebook as he begins to smile, as right now he had just learned a fascinating discovery, that not only can he tamper with his own body, but he can tamper with the body of others. And so far there didn't seem to be any drawbacks with this. As this is where we now continue on with the story, leading up to the UA entrance exams. Cause you see, throughout the many months that went by, Deku will be training hard in his quirk, and by that I mean he'll be learning so much about the human body, reading multiple books, but not only just the human body, but multiple bodies of different animals, of different creatures. Overall, Deku will be learning as much as he could. Cause you see, his quirk he could really do anything with his body, but not only that, but he also realized that he could do anything with other people's bodies as well, as all he needed was a simple touch to completely just manipulate it. But you see, Deku made sure to use this power wisely, since he already knew that if information like this got out to the public about it, people will be very wary of Deku. And he already knew how people would judge him because of the fact of how his quirk already made him look. So he's gonna make sure that, not to give them even more reason to judge. Not that he would really care. As you see, Deku will continue on training and learning more and more until eventually it will be finally time for the UA entrance exams. And I'm just gonna tell you right now, Deku goes through the entire exams quite easily, as he doesn't even get nervous when he enters there, which means he doesn't encounter Uraraka. He doesn't have that encounter with Ida either, as after that Deku just simply ends up going through the whole exam quite easily. As eventually it will be finally time for the robot the robot portion of the exams. Deku would actually be the first one out the gate, as he immediately begins to take down the robot. As using his transfiguration, Deku actually hardens his body, similar to Kirishima, as he ends up bursting through the robots with ease. And then the surprising thing about this will be Kirishima will be there actually watching this in surprise, as honestly he felt very inspired by Deku, as he actually wondered if Deku could help him out with his quirk. As Deku once again goes through a bunch of robots and racking up a bunch of points, this is when suddenly the 0 pointer would then arrive, as it begins to wreak havoc all around the entire area. And seeing this, Deku's plan was to simply just avoid it, but this is when he then stops as he sees Uraraka under the rubble. And you see, seeing this, Deku immediately acts with a serious expression as he rushes at the robot, and just as the 0 pointer was actually about to crush Uraraka, Deku ends up jumping up into the air with amazing speed, surprising everyone. As you see, at the very last moment, Deku had actually changed his legs into that of a rabbit, allowing him to pretty much jump extremely high. As thanks to this, Deku was able to jump so high to the point where he reaches the 0 pointer, and thanks to this, Deku ends up finally inflating his right arm, as it will be pretty similar to Luffy when he goes Gear 3rd. As thanks to this, Deku ends up inflating his arm all the way to the point where it's pretty much towering over the ginormous 0 pointer, and right in front of everyone's eyes in amazement, people would then see Deku punch the 0 pointer and completely obliterate it with a single punch. As the 0 pointer would go down and honestly just collapse far away from Uraraka, everyone will see Deku then begin to fall from the sky, until suddenly Deku once again transforms his body as he transforms his arms into wings, allowing him to land gracefully onto the ground without a single bit of damage towards him, as everyone could do nothing more but look at him in pure amazement. Deku however ignores the gazes as he focuses more on Uraraka, and after lifting up the rubble, he actually ends up seeing that her leg was injured. Seeing this, Deku then decides to take a risk, as soon as he ends up giving Uraraka his hands, to which she does the same thing. This is when Deku actually ends up using his quirk. And although it's a very hard process for Deku, since he doesn't have that much experience when it comes to manipulating the souls of other people, he only knows how to manipulate his own. Luckily, it ends up working out pretty okay, as Uraraka's leg immediately begins to heal up, which surprises Uraraka since the pain that she once felt was now completely gone. As Deku ends up looking at this, he ends up making a mental note to write this down, as this is when Recovery Girl would then arrive, as this will then be the announcement that the end of the exams had finally been announced. As with this, we can now continue on with the story. Now, after a couple of weeks after the exams, we actually end up seeing Deku then soon get his results, as to no surprise at all, Deku actually ends up reaching the very top score. Surprising Inko, Deku was not surprised at all, as after that, the both of them would then celebrate, as we now turn to the very next day. After that, Deku ends up going to UA as he eventually ends up arriving at Class 1A, and when he does, he actually ends up saying that he would immediately become the center of attention. As this went one by one, all the students begin to actually make mutters about the fact that Deku was the one who scored the top score. Just as Deku would then go to sit down, this one suddenly Kirishima would then run over to Deku. As Deku ended up looking at Kirishima, wondering if he was going to do something, this when Kirishima would then actually tell Deku that he was amazing, with many other students following in soon. Now soon after this when suddenly explosions would then be heard as Bakugo begins screaming at Deku, as he begins to announce that Deku was so-called ruining his moment and everything, and that he was the only one that was supposed to graduate from the pathetic school into UA, but unfortunately Deku did not listen to him. And in fact, Deku just completely trolled Bakugo throughout the entire time. Now right before things can get actually physical and violent, this is when the door would then open as Uraraka would then walk in. And immediately recognizing Deku, she would immediately run over and thank him for saving her, as this one's finally Aizawa would also arrive as well, announcing the very beginning of their class, as well as the fact that they also need to take a quirk apprehension test. Now right before they actually take the test though, Aizawa does make that fake threat saying that if none of them end up meeting up to his standards, that he will end up expelling them. Twitch hearing all this caused many students to tense, except for Deku, who in the background was actually end up looking at Aizawa with an analytic look, as he could already tell that Aizawa was lying. Now you see, after this we end up seeing everyone go through the practices, and this time Deku goes through it quite easily, once again reaching the top score and pissing off Bakugo even further. Now Bakugo will be making a bunch of curses to Deku, but unfortunately Aizawa had enough of it, as he simply wraps around Bakugo with his cloth, as he tells Bakugo to shut up. And now after this though, eventually they end up all passing, as just like the events in the main timeline, it still ends up happening, as after that they'll then begin to just go to their regular classes. Now you see, I'm not going to really change much from this portion of the story here, except the only difference here is the fact that, thanks to the fact that Deku didn't really have too many acquaintances in this one, since the only one he really talked to was Uraraka, since she was the only one to approach Deku. That meant that Deku didn't have exactly too many friends in this timeline. Not only that, but he wasn't exactly as social either. But still nonetheless, Deku was going through a pretty easy life in UA, until eventually it will be finally time for the quirk battles, as this is when finally Ame will end up arriving at the classroom, and just like that he tells everyone to suit up, as it was finally time for the team battles to begin. Now you see, eventually after everyone finally ends up dressing up into their hero costumes, which by the way in this timeline, Deku is not exactly a full All Might fanboy and everything, instead Deku is more relaxed and actually has his own ideas for his hero costume. As in this timeline, Deku's costume is actually just a simple black t-shirt with long black pants, and not only that but black boots, along with a lab coat. And to be more precise, I mean a doctor's lab coat. As soon after seeing everyone's costume and commenting how cool they were, this is when Ame would then bring up the teams, as this is when the same teams would then be formed just like they do in canon, with Deku teaming up with Uraraka, and Ida and Bakugo teaming up with each other. Now just like in the main timeline, Bakugo will be very happy to face off against Deku, as he sends him a cocky smirk, all the while Deku just sends him a completely blank and laid back one, as Deku then does something very surprising, yet also something that very much pisses off Bakugo, as he simply ends up picking his boogers and then suddenly ends up flicking one directly onto Bakugo's new hero costume, pissing off Bakugo even further. As this is when finally, after clearing up everyone, they eventually end up finally going through with the battle. Now in this timeline, Deku begins to already make a plan with Uraraka, as in a very laid back tone, he pretty much explains to her that Bakugo was already heading towards him, and that means that Ida will be up there defending the place all by himself. As Deku would then explain that after everything was good and clear, he will actually end up sending Uraraka a signal that will let her know to finally end up taking out Ida, so that way they can actually pass the exams. But right as he was done saying this though, this is when Bakugo would then suddenly burst in just as Deku was finished talking, as he throws an explosion directly at Deku's face, all the while Deku just looks at the explosion with a blank expression. As the explosion would actually end up hitting Deku straight up in the face, surprising everyone, as All Might begins to actually call out for Deku, asking if he was alright, before beginning to scold Bakugo for using such unnecessary violence. As everyone else ends up looking at the scene with pure horror, this is when the smoke would then clear, as Deku begins to talk, surprising everyone that he was actually still alive. And everyone will be even more surprised as once the smoke is cleared, they actually see that Deku was completely fine, as there was not even a single scratch on him or even his hero costume, as Deku begins to explain to Bakugo that it was rude to ruin his conversation. Now Bakugo begins to get very angry, as this is when he begins to throw an explosion once again, all while Deku begins to avoid him, as well as send a signal towards Uraraka telling her to leave, to which she will do so. As after this is where we then get the fight between Bakugo and Deku, as immediately Deku begins to actually harden up his body, as this is when he then rushes at Bakugo with amazing speed, surprising Bakugo, as this is when Deku would then land Bakugo with a nasty gut punch, which caused Bakugo to actually spit up a little bit of vomit. Now as he actually looks at Deku in surprise, this is when Deku was not done, as he raises his elbow and it slams it hard into Bakugo's shoulder, causing Bakugo to nearly fade into unconsciousness. But wait, Deku was not done just yet, as he then grabs Bakugo's arm and then suddenly flips him over on his back, as Bakugo would then be slammed onto the ground so hard that it actually ends up causing a crack to form underneath it, as Bakugo ends up reeling back from the pain. Now this catches everyone off guard, since from their very own definition, Bakugo seems to have the slight advantage when he threw that earlier attack at Deku, but now it seems as if the whole situation was now reversed, as now Deku begins to literally obliterate Bakugo, beating the crap out of him. Cause you see, the one thing that Bakugo had over Deku was range, but when it came to close combat, Bakugo stood no chance. As Bakugo begins to get even more angry as Deku continues landing more and more devastating blows on him, eventually Bakugo then finally had enough as he ends up shooting off an explosion to get some distance between him and Deku before finally he decides to activate his gauntlet. Now even though All Might would do the same thing and tell Bakugo not to do so, Bakugo would do the same thing and not listen, as he then suddenly ends up releasing a ginormous explosion heading directly towards Deku's direction. Now the explosion will be let off, causing a ginormous amount of smoke and debris to fall in, all the while Bakugo will be very impressed by the power of the gauntlet, all the while All Might will be scolding him. But before Bakugo can continue praising his gauntlet and begin to explain that Deku will survive if he just simply dodge, this is when suddenly Bakugo will then feel his nose then be broken, as suddenly literally bursting through the mist like a bullet. We actually see Deku sending out a punch towards Bakugo, but you see on the side of Deku's knuckles, there was like this ginormous part that was actually stretched out. If you guys want to think about it, think of that punch that Mahito did to Yuji, where he nearly broke Yuji's face. That's what Deku did to Bakugo at that very moment. As Bakugo ends up reeling back from the pain, screaming out in just pure agony, as literally Deku almost broke his face with that punch. As you see, Deku, to him it was completely fair. After all, Bakugo nearly killed him, so it was only fair that Deku did the same thing. I mean, come on now. As Bakugo ends up kneeling down on the ground and reeling back from the pain, he tries one last attempt to get back at Deku as he tries to release another explosion, but unfortunately Deku already knew that by now they were taking way too long. As right as Bakugo was about to unleash the explosion, Deku ends up kicking the gauntlet away as he ends up suddenly kicking Bakugo in the face with everything he's got, knocking him out. And at that very moment though, this is when Deku would then actually hear a call from Uraraka on the mic as she pretty much begins to ask Deku for assistance, to which Deku decides to do so. As eventually Deku ends up arriving at the area where Uraraka was, as Ida will be there actually blitzing her in speeds as she tries her best to avoid them. But now that Deku was here, it was a 2v1, and unfortunately for Ida, he gets packed up quite easily as he gets defeated by Deku. As after that, both Deku and Uraraka will end up winning the exams, as just like that, everyone will just feel inspired by this as they decide to go through their own exams. Now after this, we actually end up seeing something very interesting here. Cause you see, after the end of the fight and right before Bakugo gets taken to Recovery Girl, Deku actually ends up healing him completely, using his transfiguration to pretty much fix up Bakugo's body, reverting it back to how it once was. Now Bakugo will still be under unconsciousness, which was completely fine, as after all, Deku did not want to deal with his tantrum. As after that, Deku ends up leaving the scene as he already knew that that blow that he landed on Bakugo's face would have definitely left a scar, so it was better to just heal him up now than deal with the hassle later on. As I just wanted to say that right before we continue on with the story. Now you see, continuing on with the events of the story, we actually end up seeing something very interesting here. As you see, most of the events are just simply Class 1A and getting to know all of them, but you see, the thing is, we actually get a very good introduction to Deku's character here, or more or less his personality. Because you see, instead of Deku being the way how he was in the main timeline, this Deku was more laid back, more blunt, and obviously way more of a troll, but he only did that to Bakugo since, you know, Bakugo basically deserved it. And speaking of which, Bakugo and Deku's dynamic would be completely changed, as instead of Deku pretty much being terrified of Bakugo, well, it would be pretty much just both Deku and Bakugo competing against each other. But that was mostly leaned towards Bakugo, since Deku doesn't really see Bakugo as competition. As eventually, after many of these events end up going by, we end up finally getting to USJ. As them arriving there would not really change that much, as when they end up arriving, they soon end up meeting with Hero 13, and things proceed to go pretty smoothly, until the villains finally end up arriving. As when they arrive, Aizawa doesn't hesitate as he rushes into action, and just as he was in the midst of taking down multiple arrays of villains, This is when suddenly a portal would then open up right behind the rest of Class 1A as Kodogiri would then arrive. Now seeing Kodogiri there, immediately Bakugo as well as Kirishima have rushed over to attack him. But seeing this, Deku already knew that they made a big mistake, as right before he can call them out though, this is when suddenly he will then be warped away along with the rest of Class 1A. As this is where we now change scenes. Eventually we end up seeing Deku once again, but this time he's currently at a ship along with Tsu as well as Mineta, as they are currently surrounded by a bunch of villains. However, fortunately they are able to get away from the situation without too much problem. As you see, Deku actually ends up using his body as a slingshot, manipulating his body as well as his soul to pretty much just slingshot both Mineta and Tsu away, with him along with them. As thanks to this, they're able to escape from the shipwrecked area with relative ease and also catching the villains off guard. Now eventually they are able to land and eventually end up returning back to their classmates, but you see on the way of returning back, they end up seeing Aizawa as he was currently being beaten down by the Nomu. This ends up catching them off guard, all the while Deku tells them to go on ahead as he was going to help out. Now immediately they think that Deku is crazy, but unfortunately Deku was too much in his head to really think about them at the moment, as right now his main focus was helping out Aizawa. Now you see, as Deku was approaching, Shigaraki would see this as he immediately begins to activate Kodogiri, he immediately begins to call upon Kodogiri to warp away his hand, so that he can actually end up catching Deku off guard. But you see, unaware to Shigaraki, that was a big mistake. As when the portal opened and Shigaraki's hand was reaching out to reach Deku, to the surprise of Shigaraki, Deku just completely latches onto his hand. But what surprises Shigaraki even more is that when Deku does, Shigaraki will then feel a ginormous amount of pain as he would then be pulled into the portal as he appears right in front of Deku, but now his arm was completely wrangled. Like literally it was moving around awkwardly in a very awkward motion, something that a normal human body cannot be capable of. As Shigaraki will be reeling back from the pain, telling Deku to stop, this is when Deku will then kick Shigaraki in the face as he then rushes over to the Nomu. Now the Nomu finally took notice of Shigaraki actually being harmed, so thanks to that, it took away its attention from Aizawa and rushed at Deku. And when it did, it threw a full powerful punch at Deku's face, to which Deku just simply let it happen. Now Aizawa seeing this begins to panic as he actually thought that he failed his student, but this is when he would then be surprised. As you see, Deku was able to absorb the shockwave from the blow, as it just simply ran through his body and then he was soon able to just tank it. Because you see, this was once again thanks to Deku's quirk, as basically any physical injury do not have any effect on Deku, as he's literally able to just manipulate it to where his body had just completely been unaffected by it. So that means that any bruises, any cuts, or really anything like that, Deku can just simply heal from it. As this is when we then get the battle between Deku and the Nomu. And you see, this fight actually goes pretty interesting here. Now Shigaraki is able to soon recover, although he is still panting in pain, mostly because of the fact that his wrangled arm is not, returned back to how it was. As after all, Deku had tampered with Shigaraki's body for a moment. As Shigaraki begins to go on a whole spiel, talking about Nomu being the perfect weapon and how he's going to be able to compete with All Might, saying that it would have no problem taking care of Deku, Deku will be somehow, someway able to keep up with the Nomu. As you see, Deku would actually be using his body to absorb the kinetic energy from the Nomu, pretty much turning it flabby and everything so that way it can absorb the blows. While the Nomu will do the same thing to Deku, as Deku will be able to use the power of the Nomu against it, yet the Nomu was able to tank it. They'll go back and forth with many barrages as they try their best to overpower one another, but unfortunately it was not getting anywhere. Until eventually they do end up stumbling upon something. As you see, during the fight against the Nomu, Deku actually took a look at its soul and immediately he was able to find out something. Cause you see, in most situations, the soul was just completely floating there in an empty like space, pretty much just to describe the body and everything. But you see, this soul was different, cause you see, this soul had like a bunch of strings attached to it. It was pretty much just completely tied up and everything. Like the person's body was just completely filled up with a bunch of things that were not supposed to be there. So thanks to this, Deku then gets an idea. As every single time both the Nomu and Deku clash with one another, and as soon as Deku gets into close contact with the Nomu, he actually begins to slowly but surely, cut off the strings of the Nomu, pretty much allowing its soul to return back to how it once was. The only problem was the fact that this was very complicated since there were so many strings attached to it. But soon, after fighting it over and over again and keeping up with it, eventually Deku was able to pull it off, as he's able to pretty much untangle the soul of the Nomu and cutting off his connections to whatever was holding it back, as Deku then suddenly ends up returning the Nomu's body back to how it once was, with one last clash. As this is when Shigaraki will be there witnessing his creation, the one that was specifically designed for him to use to kill All Might, had now finally reverted back to its once human appearance, as everyone ends up looking at the scene in complete shock. As the human that was once the Nomu ends up looking around before collapsing down to the ground, as it was completely exhausted after the very horrifying transformation it underwent. Deku ends up looking at it with a raised eyebrow, as he simply wanted to do nothing more but study it, but unfortunately now was not the time, as he turns to Shigaraki with a cold stare, as he pretty much says that this fight was over. Shigaraki, seeing how Deku was reacting and seeing how he was treating him, gets infuriated, as this is when he then rushes at Deku, saying that he was no All Might and that he had no right to do this. But unfortunately, before he can go even further, this is when the rest of the heroes would then arrive along with All Might, as the students were able to pull off a pretty similar strategy and send Ida ahead. And seeing this, immediately they begin to get control over the situation, as Kodagiri, having no other choice, would have no choice but to teleport him and Shigaraki away, leaving the others to pretty much be captured. And Deku will be there at first watching everything until he eventually ends up being approached by the police, as they take Deku in order to interrogate him to find out what exactly had occurred. Not only that, but to also find out what exactly he did to the Nomu, as this is where we now change scenes, as well as do a time skip. As following the events after the USJ, eventually things begin to settle down. The media was still being quite hysterical about the whole thing and beginning to try to ask as many questions as they could to find out more about the incident, but unfortunately UA did not allow them to know anything more. And during the time when that was happening, Deku will be there at the police station being questioned, as accompanying the police will be none other than All Might, Aizawa, and as well as Nezu, as Aizawa had just recently joined them since he got out of the hospital, luckily early thanks to the help of Recovery Girl. Now after this, they immediately begin to question Deku, asking him exactly what went down, and that's when Deku had to reveal a basic description of his quirk. Now hearing this, immediately everyone will be very interested, but once Deku begins to actually announce that he also has the ability to pretty much tamper with other people's bodies, this immediately caused many of the police that were in the room to look at Deku with a look of suspicion, since after all, in the wrong hands that quirk can be very dangerous. But thankfully, they didn't treat Deku like a villain after hearing that, as most of the time they talk to him, they just look at him with suspicious looks. As after a little bit more questioning, Deku was free to leave, as he would just end up going about with his day, as he didn't care about what they thought about him or the suspicions that they now had, as after all, Deku knew that he was going to prove them all wrong. He wasn't going to become a villain. Now after this, Deku eventually ends up returning back to UA, and after hearing everyone's happiness at seeing him and everything, eventually things begin to go back to normal, as we now continue on with the story. Now after many of these events have finally passed by and things begin to settle down, they're once again picked right back up, as on a certain day, we actually end up seeing a bunch of classes from different areas of UA actually stopping to look at Class 1A, since by now many reports about the whole villain incident has spread, and not only that, but Class 1A has become quite a bit of a celebrity after the incident. Now immediately, when the kids are there, they will be there watching Class 1A, trying to scope out the competition. But unfortunately, they didn't really get to do much, since Bakugo as well as Deku just simply leave, since both of them have no care, and both of them have their own reasons for not really caring about it. Mostly because of the fact that Bakugo already believes that no matter what's coming up, he will end up winning, and Deku doesn't really care since, in all honesty, he has better things to do. As after this, we now continue on until the very next day, as that's when the UA Sports Festival would then be announced. Now this caused everyone to be very excited about this, and not only that, but this is the moment where Todoroki will actually declare a challenge to Deku, as by now, Deku has pretty much been seen as the strongest person in the class. After the whole Nomu incident and seeing what he had done, many of the students were very impressed with Deku, as it seems as if he'd actually be able to keep up on many of the levels of that of a pro hero. And after hearing this declaration, many of them will be pretty hyped up and excited for it, until Bakugo then jumps in, saying that if anyone was going to face off against Deku, it will be him. Now this causes everyone to get riled up even further, as they're even more excited for the exams, all the while Deku will be there just thinking over on everything, as he was already preparing for every challenge that comes up ahead. As we now do a time skip leading up to the UA Sports Festival. Now everyone would be there, as the crowd would be cheering up in excitement as President Mike begins to explain the rules before finally announcing them to begin. And immediately, as soon as they do, this is when everyone would then see something surprising, as Deku's legs would then transform. As Deku ends up transforming them into that of a deer, as he uses this opportunity to then suddenly end up blitzing every last one of them and to get a head start. This ends up surprising everyone, including Todoroki, before finally they all start acting, as Todoroki will end up freezing them in place to give himself the opportunity, with only a few of them being able to avoid Todoroki's, attempt at stopping them. Now using this opportunity, Deku remains in first place throughout the majority of it, as he takes down the robots that appear at the beginning of the obstacle before finally eventually reaching the obstacle race. Now when he does, he's easily able to get past the entire minefield by simply just sprouting out wings as he just simply flies over them. And everyone seeing this would think that was super cool, as eventually they end up seeing the finish line. As this is when Bakugo and Todoroki were finally making their way to the obstacle race, but unfortunately it was too late, as Deku, by the time they had finally arrived, had already passed the finish line, causing him to gain first place and also 10 million points. As eventually, after a little bit of struggle, both Bakugo and Todoroki also end up passing the finish line, as unfortunately Bakugo ends up getting second place and Todoroki ends up getting third, as they're both disappointed about the fact that they lost to Deku so easily. But luckily they didn't have to wait long, as after the obstacle race we finally have the cavalry battles. Now in this one, Deku ends up forming up the same team just as everyone else, and just like that the battles were on, except the thing is, thanks to Deku's ability, it was kind of extremely hard for them to even get past him, since Deku just simply stretched out his arms into a very cartoony like style as he just simply swats them aside. Every single time a team were to get close to him, he just simply slaps them aside. And this will go on for quite a while until finally Ida ends up using his nitro boost, as thanks to this, Todoroki was actually able to get in close and get back the headband. Now this will surprise everyone and catch everyone off guard, as they all think that Todoroki had finally stolen away from Midoriya. But this one they would then all be surprised as Deku would then suddenly end up stretching his neck, surprising everyone and catching them off guard of just how creepy that was. As this is when Deku just simply ends up biting onto the headband that Todoroki had just taken and puts it back onto his head. As this ends up causing Todoroki to be in shock, but he tries one last attempt to get it back, this time resorting into using his flames, and when he does, this is when suddenly the bell would then ring, pretty much causing the end of the cavalry battle and once again putting Deku's team in first place. As after this, we can now continue on finally into the 1v1 matches. Now before we enter, I do want to let you guys know that there was a brief intermission where Todoroki pretty much told Deku about his whole backstory and everything and why he needs to beat him. But the thing is, Deku really showed no care at all for this story, as after all, Deku didn't really show that much empathy towards it. As in Deku's eyes, after Todoroki finished telling him that tale, Deku thought that Todoroki had to be the dumbest human alive, as to simply limit yourself in order to piss off someone has got to be the stupidest thing that he ever heard. As after this, we finally end up getting the very first battle with Deku facing off against Shinso. Now immediately during this fight, Shinso begins to try being the ultimate troll here and begins to pretty much just gaslight Deku. And the thing is, this does not work on Deku at all, as Deku just simply ignores Shinso and with a simple kick he just kicks him out the arena, as Shinso was not able to do anything. But yet, even though he was out the arena, Shinso kept on rambling over and over again, seeing that Deku did not know and understand what it was like to have a quirk that made him seem like the villain. And this is when Deku then suddenly turns towards Shinso and with a very cold and stoic look, he tells Shinso to shut up, as this will cause Shinso to immediately clamor up, as well as causing many people who saw Deku's expression to suddenly end up shifting a little bit, as they actually were a little bit shocked about Deku's expression, since most of the time throughout the entire fight Deku was laid back. In fact, he just seemed to be relaxing and chilling, not really taking this whole exam seriously, so they never really saw the very cold and calculative side of him. As after this, eventually the other matches begin to play out pretty similarly, all the way until eventually it will be finally time for the 1v1 match against Todoroki and Deku. Now when they end up arriving on the scene, Todoroki immediately starts by trying to send a ginormous block of ice towards Deku, but unfortunately that doesn't really work out, as Deku just simply is able to inflate his fists, making them ginormous as he just punches the ground over and over again, disrupting the path of the ice. Now this will go on for quite a while until Todoroki tries to get in close, trying to get into close combat with Deku, but that doesn't work as Deku simply is able to roundhouse kick him in the face, sending him collapsing down to the ground. As by now Deku is just simply bullying Todoroki, throwing him across the arena, as if you guys want a reference to this, look up the fight between Naruto and Konohamaru during the Chunin exams, as literally throughout this entire battle, legit, Deku was just beating up on Todoroki, not giving him the opportunity here. Now, just as Todoroki was actually about to give up, this is when Deku begins to pretty much call him out on being pathetic, and explaining how what Todoroki is doing is just being stupid. Now Deku isn't giving Todoroki a whole impactful speech, but instead Deku's being quite blunt with him, and pretty much just showing him and pretty much detailing him about how stupid he was being. And this causes Todoroki to actually have the same effect as he does in the main timeline, causing him to immediately begin to use his fire and telling Deku that he will regret it. And Deku seeing this just shrugs, as this is when he then does something surprising, He tells Todoroki that since he was showing him a new trick, he would do the same thing, as a way of respect. As this is when Deku would then do something surprising, as he then turns his hands into blades, surprising everyone since they never seen Deku done it before. He transforms his limbs into that of animals. He had been able to stretch them and inflate them, but never was he able to transform them into that of blades and things like that. As this made many people question what exactly is Deku's quirk. As seeing the blades, Todoroki just shrugs as he then immediately sends a stream of fire towards Deku, with Deku rushing towards him using 2 blades. As both of them would eventually end up colliding, this ends up resulting in a ginormous explosion, as this ends up causing a ginormous amount of smoke to fill in the entire arena, with it soon dispersing. As when it does, we actually end up seeing the final climax of the battle, as we see that Deku had actually won, as Todoroki will be there on the ground with 2 slash marks across his chest, but you see even with those 2 slash marks, he'll be smiling. As at first the entire arena will be silent before they begin cheering and applauding for the amazing battle, as Deku would then be declared the winner. As now that Todoroki had finally been beaten, we can now move on with the story all the way to the final battle between Bakugo and Deku. As this is where we now change scenes. As we see both of them currently at the arena, we see Bakugo immediately begin talking about how he was gonna win. All the while Deku will be there silently, as this is when finally Midnight will be there as she announced the fights to begin. Bakugo will rush at Deku and immediately throw a bunch of explosions at him, all while Deku will rush at Bakugo, immediately getting into close combat, as both of them will begin clashing with each other. Now this will go on for quite a while, as both of them will end up causing a ginormous amount of shockwaves to spread around the entire arena, as everyone will end up looking at them in pure surprise as they couldn't believe that these guys were just simply kids. And the main reason for this one is because of the fact that after seeing how strong Deku had gotten, Bakugo will be dedicating himself to try to become even stronger than him, causing him to be a little bit stronger than he was in the main timeline here, as he was actually able to put up a pretty good fight against Deku. But you see, unfortunately, Deku was just a different breed. As literally thanks to transfiguration, Deku was literally able to harden his body and prevent it from taking any real damage from Bakugo's explosions. And thanks to this, Bakugo was the only one getting really damaged here because Deku was able to make himself move fast, as he transformed his legs into that of a deer once again, causing him to literally move around the entire arena at very fast speeds. As this will continue on for quite a while, as both of them will end up going back and forth, with Bakugo slowly but surely losing. This is when Bakugo would then go on a whole spiel as he begins to just go on a whole rant, all the while Deku would just simply troll him and clown on Bakugo. And this will go on back and forth for quite a while until eventually this is when Bakugo begins to actually speak some true facts. As this is when Deku actually can tell that Bakugo is not lying when he says certain things. As eventually this is when finally the whole truth finally ends up getting out. As Bakugo, even though he was battered and bruised as well as bloody, we see him still end up getting up, as this is when he finally ends up admitting that he was tired of the guilt. Cause you see, throughout many of the years that went by, Bakugo actually slowly but surely felt guilt about what he told Deku so many years ago. That being the fact that Deku was going to become a villain in the future. And you see, at first Bakugo has used that as leverage to pretty much make himself seem tough and pretty much made everyone worship Bakugo instead of Deku. But you see, as time begins to go on, we actually end up finally seeing that Bakugo actually begins to feel a little bit of humanity, as he felt guilty about everything that happened between him and Deku. Now, you know it's not in Bakugo's nature to apologize for anything like that, but honestly he just wanted to get rid of this feeling mostly because of the fact that it was getting annoying, as he always tried to suppress it by being more angry. And the thing is, that anger was not faked, it was actually true anger, as he will be angry at not only himself but also at Deku for proving him wrong. As after hearing this out from Bakugo, Deku will be honestly caught off guard by this, which gave Bakugo the opportunity as he rushes at Deku, as he decided to end it all with a Howitzer impact. And Deku, seeing the attack approaching, just simply sat there as he let the attack hit him. This will cause a ginormous explosion to once again form around the entire arena, as everyone ends up looking at with suspense. As just when it seems as if Deku may have lost, this is when finally when the smoke ends up clearing, we even seeing Bakugo currently right now on his knees, as he's no longer able to stand up. As not only that, but he was also unconscious. That attack had taken everything that Bakugo had, although Deku would be there, as the only thing that was really damaged was his clothing. As seeing that Bakugo was no longer going to be able to get up, this is when finally Deku would then be declared the winner, as this would end up causing everyone to immediately cheer. But you see, even under all that cheer, Deku would still be looking at Bakugo before he suddenly ends up walking away, not saying anything more, which was everything that was alright with Bakugo. Cause you see, the thing is, Bakugo did not apologize to Deku, and he didn't want to apologize to him. He was just tired about feeling all guilty about the whole thing, as when he wants to face off against Deku, he didn't want to feel guilty about it. As now he's actually able to finally contend with Deku and finally able to face him off without feeling as if he needs to, apologize or anything like that. Since by now he pretty much just confessed what he had done and that's it. He moved on from it. As now with this, we can now continue on with the story. Now many events happen after the UA Sports Festival. By now everything in Class 1A has finally settled down a little bit, and by now Deku does not completely troll Bakugo at all, since now that Bakugo has finally kind of, not really apologized, just simply realized that, hey, I know what I did was wrong and let's move on from it. Deku doesn't really just completely troll on Bakugo. Instead, he just simply lays back in the rest of the class and mostly just keeps to himself, with the only one really interacting with him like that being Uraraka. Not only that, but this is where we also get the opportunity to actually find out their hero names. And in this timeline, instead of Deku just being called, Deku, in this timeline, Deku's name would actually be none other than, Dr. Death. And the main reason for this was because of the fact that Deku's quirk, he has finally realized that his quirk can just simply end someone's life in an instant. All he needs is just simply one touch. But at the same time though, he could also find a way to prevent death. Not forever of course, but at least prevent it from happening immediately. As he can literally heal up people, or better yet, he can just completely, age them backwards. As he can literally make them younger if they're being too old, or overall he can just pretty much heal people. So basically, yeah, Deku can just switch from being either the cure of death or the bringer. As after that, we can now continue on with the story as we eventually then get the internship, and in this timeline, Deku actually internship with none other than Recovery Girl. So it's mostly because of the fact that Recovery Girl is actually a doctor and actually has some information about human anatomy. This actually gives Deku the opportunity to learn even more about the human body, continuing his studies, and not only that, but allowing him to get even stronger with his transfigurations. As this will continue on for the rest of the arc, as Deku continues honing and training his skills, not only that, but also healing. As while working under, Recovery Girl, Deku is actually able to heal up people quite instantly. As thanks to the fact that he knows more about the human body now, thanks to the help of Recovery Girl, and also thanks to all the studying he's been doing, he actually ends up helping out quite a lot thanks to his internship. And he gets even better sooner or later when Deku actually ends up healing up All Might. As during the time when the Hero Killer arc was going down, instead of Deku helping out with the whole incident, it would actually be Mirio, as just like in many of my other what ifs, he'll be the, next wielder of One for All. But you see, while Mirio was over there in the Hero Killer arc, here, currently right now, getting treatment from Deku will be none other than All Might. As Deku was actually able to replenish All Might's body by manipulating the soul. Using Transfiguration, he was able to bring it back to how it once was, surprising All Might, and as well as Recovery Girl, since this injury was so bad that even she couldn't fix it. So thanks to this, All Might is once again able to go for very long runs of doing hero work without any rest, to which he's very grateful for Deku for that. Now this will eventually end up leading up to finally the final exams, as now that the Hero Killer arc has now passed, everyone ends up returning back to Class 1A, trying to show off their new improvements. And lo and behold, Deku will be the one to actually improve the most, as in that training, Deku was able to move past and actually surpass everyone in an instant. And Bakugo will be watching all this as he'll be very upset, mostly because of the fact that, similar to the main timeline, he felt as if he wasted his time in his last internship. Now this will continue on until finally it'll eventually be time for them to face off against their teachers, as we end up having Deku and Bakugo facing off against All Might. Now you see, when they end up facing off against All Might, events begin to play out pretty similar to the canon in the very beginning of it, as unfortunately Bakugo does not want to work with Deku. But this soon ends up turning out to be a mistake, as All Might shows that even though he was currently holding back, he was still easily able to beat down on Bakugo. But when it came to Deku though, it was a different story, as unfortunately none of All Might's physical attacks really did any damage to Deku, since thanks to Transfiguration, he was just able to simply brush it off. It didn't do any pain to him. So the thing is, pretty much All Might was just beating up on a punching bag that can take all his blows. And this will continue on for quite a while, as Bakugo tries to intervene multiple times but fails. Until eventually, finally, Bakugo then decides to actually work with Deku, or more precisely, Deku just decides to finally work with Bakugo here, as they both end up working together, with Deku being the one to receive all of All Might's attacks since he's the one who's able to tank it, and Bakugo being the one to dish them out. This will go on for quite a while until eventually they decide to actually do something pretty cool, as when Bakugo was rearing up a generous explosion, Deku had also tampered a little bit with Bakugo's soul, as this actually caused him to sweat a lot more and causing him to actually release a generous explosion, so big to the point where it actually ended up covering up the entire area where they were fighting, also catching All Might off guard. As smoke and debris would fall over the entire area as All Might continues hunting down the two of them, eventually he ends up finding out that both of them actually end up passing the finish line, with Bakugo not needing the help of Deku in this one since, well, Deku just simply replenishes his body so that way he can run along with him. So thanks to this, Bakugo and Deku end up passing the exams much easier than they did in the main timeline. As this is where we now finally move on to the Forest Training Camp. Now this one, the very beginning of it does not really change that much, as after finding out how well they did after their internship, they immediately decide to go to the Forest Training Camp. Now all of Class 1A would end up arriving there as they all end up getting prepared for the journey up ahead, and during the time there, they'll soon end up meeting up with the Pussycats, to which they immediately begin to act all friendly and everything, before basically throwing them into a forest full of deadly creatures that were created by one of them. Now luckily though, thanks to all the improvements that Class 1A has undergone, every last one of them show how powerful they became. Especially Deku in this timeline, as we actually end up seeing that Deku plays multiple different roles in their victory of passing through this forest quite easily. Because you see, the thing is, if you guys actually remember, in JJK, Mahito is actually able to split himself up, pretty much, even though the other self is way weaker than his original self, and that's basically what Deku does here. As he actually ends up splitting himself up multiple times, that way he can actually end up healing up the group, and not only that, but he's actually able to continue just navigating throughout the entire forest while at the same time destroying any creatures that come their way. As by the time the rest of Class 1A eventually ends up arriving, every last member of the Pussycats would actually be very surprised since they all come out completely fine, except for Bakugo, who refused treatment from Deku. As after that, every single one of them then kick off the Forest Training Camp, as we end up having Koda still being mean to Deku, except he doesn't, hit him in the, how Ida calls it, Midoriya scrotum or something like that. Come on, let's be honest here. He hit him in the balls. But that's enough of that, as we can now continue on with the story. As you see, eventually going through the rest of the Forest Training Camp, not much really changes here since most of the things are quite easily and relaxing, as Deku still remains stuck to his studies but also helped around during the camp. Until eventually it'll be finally time for them to go on a little bit of an expedition, as it was finally time for them to go through their miniature trials. Now when they go through their trials, Deku will be the same thing as he does in the main timeline, as he'll be left alone. But you see, as Deku was just wandering through the forest alone, this when suddenly blue flames would then erupt, as all around chaos begins, as villains were now attacking. Now seeing this, Deku immediately looks at the location of the mountains, since he remembered that Koda had wandered off by himself, as he decided to go over there. Now see, when Deku ends up eventually arriving, he sees Koda now being attacked by Muscular, as Muscular begins to explain to Koda how he basically just slaughtered his parents, pretty much traumatizing the kid even further. However though, before it can get even worse, this is when suddenly Deku, after hearing everything that Muscular has said, would appear right in front of him, and literally hardening his fist, he then punches Muscular in the face, causing him to break his nose. Luckily though, Muscular ends up recovering from this quite easily, as he looks at Deku before laughing, as he pretty much begins to explain to Deku about how he's gonna take him down. But unfortunately for Muscular, he didn't realize just how bad things were. Cause you see, most of the time, Deku was a laid back person. Yes, he's able to be quite serious and everything, but most of the time he prefers to be laid back, not really let things affect him. But unfortunately, now was not that time, as after hearing how Muscular slaughtered Koda's parents, and how Muscular was about to literally kill Koda, Deku had finally had enough, as he decided that he was just going to make him pay, and not only him but the rest of them, as he was not going to let this night end with a bunch of tragedies, not if he could allow it. So as Muscular then charges at Deku, reinforcing himself with a bunch of muscles and everything, this is when Deku would just simply end up tapping Muscular on the shoulder. As this is when we then see a very horrendous sight, as Muscular's body would then be transfigured into that of a weapon, this being a scythe, as it ends up landing directly into Deku's hands as he holds the weapon as if he's already been very skilled at using it. And Koda will look on in just pure fright as he couldn't believe what just happened right before his eyes, as this is when Deku then turns to him before picking up Koda and just simply disappearing. Now eventually we end up turning back to Aizawa, as right now Aizawa has finally taken care of the mud clone that appeared trying to blast him, which luckily he took him down before he could, and this is when Deku would then arrive. He'll be caught off guard at first as he sees Deku just mutate his legs, back from being a bunny leg to now just being his regular ones. As right before he can go into questioning Deku, this is when Deku would then simply give him Koda, and this is when Aizawa then takes a look at Deku really, and this is when he then sees it. The entire energy of this kid was completely off. Most of the times, Deku could be very mature, and he could be very laid back, almost to the point where you could even call him lazy. But this kid was showing none of that, as Deku was cold and stoic as he looks directly at Aizawa before going into the forest. And Aizawa can do nothing more but stare at him in complete shock. Now, seeing this is when Aizawa then sighs, as this is when he then makes a mental command to tell one of the pussycats to pretty much tell everyone that they're now allowed to use their quirks, as Aizawa already knew that if he didn't let Deku use his quirk, there will be hell to pay. As just like that, a bunch of messages will be thrown out to the rest of the classes, letting them know that literally they're allowed to use their quirks at this very moment. And Deku, after hearing that was all that he needed to hear. As is when Deku will then begin to actually transform his body into that of animal parts once again, forming the classic deer legs as he then dashes through the forest at very high speeds. And thanks to being able to use his quirk and now using it to gain high speeds, Deku was able to quickly find some villains, as right before they could even do anything, Deku would then immediately just cut them up. Like there was no hesitation in his eyes as he just simply landed a very devastating blow. And you know how I said like the human anatomy thing that he learned from Recovery Girl actually helped him out when it came to transfiguration? That was not the only thing that helped out. As you see, the thing is, Deku can now literally aim his attack at certain areas where they can do the most pain or the least amount of pain, or the areas where you can actually cause the least amount of bleeding or the most. As Deku was actually able to cut up on some of the villains, causing them to literally be screaming out in agony as they lose blood slowly. And Deku would do this all around as he encounters two of them, one of them being the ones that actually release a generous amount of poison gas, and another one that was just shooting out a bunch of razor-like teeth. But eventually, as the Deku was running through just a bunch of villains, this is when he will eventually be stopped by none other than Mr. Compass, who pretty much begins to tell Deku that he needs to come along with him. But right before he can continue on explaining why he needs to come along with him, this is when Deku will then suddenly shoot out his scythe as he pretty much just tosses it as if it's a boomerang, as he actually ends up cutting up Mr. Compass's arm, catching him off guard and causing him to scream out in pain. As this is when Deku will then arrive as he then kicks him up into the air with a generous amount of force, with Deku transforming his leg at the very last instant to make sure to give him enough force to kick him up into the air. As Mr. Compass will be sent flying, this is when Deku will then jump up into the air as well, as when he does, he ends up literally pile driving Mr. Compass into the ground, and unknowingly he actually did it right in front of the rest of his pals. As legit, we actually end up seeing the rest of the villains that were currently there, seeing the display in shock, as Deku ended up landing there right in front of them, with Mr. Compass currently right now just barely even being alive. As Deku looks at them with a cold eye, pretty much explaining that they're not going to be able to leave this place alive. Now seeing this, immediately they begin to call upon Kodogiri, since by now they already realized that this was not a fight that they can win, not right now at least. And Deku, seeing that they were escaping, immediately rushed towards them in order to stop them, but this is when suddenly he actually ends up getting caught off guard. As you see, when Deku was actually trying to stop Dabi and Twice from escaping, along with Toga, this is when suddenly Deku would then also fall into a portal as well, as a portal had appeared underneath Deku, and because of the fact that he was so caught off guard by it, he would be absorbed right into it. As during that time, they successfully ended up pulling off the plan, although with a bunch of casualties. As in this timeline, instead of going after the task of kidnapping Bakugo, they were actually on the task of kidnapping Deku. As after making sure that Deku was finally captured, this is when suddenly, as soon as he was gone, multiple Nomus began to spawn around the entire area. As now that the main group of villains had disappeared, this only left the rest of them to pretty much be taken on by the Nomus. And this would end up resulting in many of the students actually taking a large amount of damage, and not only that, but even one of them having a life-threatening injury. But sooner or later, heroes would then arrive along with the police forces, as after this, we can now continue on with the story and also do a time skip. As following the events after the forest training camp, the announcements of all the events that had occurred, as well as the fact that one of the students went missing, had been reported, as this was a very traumatic event for everyone. By now, all the heroes feel very upset about this, especially since the student that got captured was one that actually helped them out. You know how I said that Deku was actually healing people while he was actually, during the internship of Recovery Girl? He was actually also healing a couple of heroes as well. So they know that the kid was a good kid, and unfortunately he had been captured. This caused many of them to be very upset, and more precisely All Might, since Deku had pretty much saved his entire career and caused him to not have an early retirement. So thanks to all these thoughts, as well as the pressure of wanting to save him, this actually ended up causing them to try to look harder for Deku, to which luckily Momo ends up coming in clutch and giving them a tracking device that tracks the location of the Nomu, with the only thing that they're missing is the hideout where the villains are, and where Deku is supposedly being held. As this is where we now change scenes. Now you see, we currently turn our attention to Deku, as by now he had finally been captured. Cause you see, after the events that had transpired during the events of the forest training camp, Deku had unfortunately fell into Kodagiri's portal and was swept into this prison. As instead of being, being held down by a chair, like they did with Bakugo in the main timeline, in this timeline they made a special containment facility for Deku practically. Now Deku will be there in this containment facility as he tries to bust out of it, but unfortunately there was no effect. As he begins to think of a new plan in order to escape, this is when suddenly walking through the darkness will be none other than a League of Villains along with Shigaraki. Now Deku is immediately able to see that all the damage he had done to them, well besides, Muscular, since if you guys don't know by now, Muscular has been killed off. Like legit, there's no way he was going to survive that much of a mutation. So unfortunately, they were not able to fix him. Luckily, the other ones who were only slightly damaged by Deku were able to still come back alive. Well, not come back alive, like they were able to patch up their injuries, I mean. So thanks to this, we end up seeing all of them surround Deku, as this is when Shigaraki would also be there. And the one thing that Deku was able to take notice of is the fact that his arm that was once mutated was now fixed up. But the thing is, there was like this weird line that was across the area where his original arm was. And Deku was able to immediately put the pieces together as he was able to find out that Shigaraki had regenerated. Now you see, Deku begins to question them exactly what's going on here, keeping up the laid back facade, all while he's trying to analyze a way to get out of here. But just as Deku was talking, this is when finally All For One's voice would then fall in, as he begins to actually talk to Deku and begin to mention things about Deku that no one should know about. What really surprised Deku is the fact that when he began talking, he also begins to list off the location of where Deku's mother is. And you see, hearing this will cause Deku to immediately begin to see red as he begins to lash out, ordering them to let him out or else. But you see, All For One would just simply laugh as he begins to explain to Deku about his quirk and everything, as well as begin to explain to Deku that practically that he was going to steal away Deku's quirk. Because you see, after so long of the information being quite confidential, it finally had been released to All For One. Except the word release would be kind of a mistake to really say, as instead it was more likely just simply stealed away from them. As you see, during the time of the UA Sports Festival when everything was going down, All For One had made sure to use Kodagiri properly to intervene in the forces there, so that way he can actually pick up on a little bit more information on all the students. Now luckily, when he actually did this, he got a lot of information from everyone except for one, this being Deku, as for some reason his information was quite confidential. It took a lot, and I mean a lot of resources, but eventually they were able to find out. As you see, the reason why Deku's ability was really kept on a tight lid was because of the fact of how much potential it had. And more precisely, if it fell into the wrong hands, it can be used for the very worst amount of purposes. So after reading up on Deku's folder and finding out all the information about Deku's quirk, All For One needed to have it. He must have it. It was destiny for him to have it. As he basically begins to tell Deku about the whole process of stealing his quirk, and once he is done, Deku would pretty much not remember anything about what happened, as literally the entire event of stealing away someone's quirk can literally leave someone practically, well, just practically hollow, as you're practically just stealing away one of their essence away from them. And Deku, after hearing this, just curses, as he then tries to think of a way to get out of here. But as All For One continues talking and beginning to explain everything that was going to happen, he then tells Deku and begins to explain to him that it might be for the better. As All For One begins to explain to Deku how it was impossible for him to really be seen as a hero thanks to his quirk. As he basically begins to explain how his quirk was basically a curse to Deku, and explain to Deku how it was better off that he didn't have it, and gave it to someone who knew how to properly use it to bring out his true potential. As it begins to go even further by telling Deku that the way that he was using his quirk was honestly quite ridiculous, as even though Deku was healing up people and doing a bunch of good with it, he was never going to bring out his true potential if he just continued going down that path. So it was better off that Deku just simply hand over the quirk to All For One, since it would be better off in more capable hands. Someone who is more willing to go through with the very devastating acts that the quirk can actually do at full power. And Deku will be there listening to all of it, as All For One finally cements the nail in the coffin by saying that as long as Deku had that quirk, he would always be seen as a potential villain. As Deku will be there in pure silence, not saying anything, this is when All For One actually smiles, thinking that he finally broke Deku's spirit, as he then says that it's finally time for them to finally go through the process. But unfortunately for All For One though, this was a big mistake. Because you see, just as All For One was lifting up Deku's containment facility, this is when suddenly Deku ended up bursting right through it just as it was lifted up, as he used the opportunity to actually put a hand directly on Spinner, as this is when Spinner's body would then suddenly end up erupting right in front of everyone's eyes, killing him off instantly. This ends up catching everyone off guard as they immediately jump away, but Deku was not done as he rushes over to the next one, as this would be none other than Shigaraki. Shigaraki, seeing Deku's approach, tries to use Decay on him, but unfortunately it doesn't work, as Deku just simply turns Shigaraki into a scythe. As this is when Deku then suddenly launches an attack directly at All For One, who simply smiles as he then blasts away the entire area. Now by now, this ends up causing a ginormous amount of scene and also causing many people to run away in terror since the whole event was not catching attention. As all around the area, we actually see heroes begin to disperse to the area, trying to find out exactly what was going on and actually trying to put a stop to it. As we see Deku and All For One beginning to battle. You can see All For One begins to chuckle as he sees Deku's display of being an absolute beast, as Deku is literally using the villains that are currently right now still working for All For One. He'll be using them and mutating them to become weapons for Deku, as all he wanted to do was kill All For One at this very moment. As the man dared to literally basically threaten Deku's mother, which was already assigned for sheer death at that very moment, as he had revealed where Inko was literally living. And to make it even worse was the fact that he went ahead and told Deku that he was not capable of bringing out his own quirk's true potential when he was literally born with it. And to finally put the final nail in the coffin was the fact that he pretty much told Deku's dream. He pretty much told Deku that his dream was pointless, as long as Deku had that quirk, he will be forever seen as a villain. So already, All For One deserved to die because of this, and Deku was not going to hesitate. As they continue on fighting with each other, as more and more heroes arrive onto the scene, trying to keep the whole destruction at bay, this is when many people of the surrounding area begin to get a view on what was happening. As that was not only people in the surrounding area, but people all around. As literally a news chapter ends up arriving as they end up showing off the fight between Deku and All For One, as he begins to make comments about the events transpiring. And All For One, seeing this, can do nothing more but laugh, as he couldn't believe just how perfect this entire scene was. As now, Deku was finally going to end up seeing the truth, and it was going to break him completely. As all around, people will see the horrifying fight between them, and they will see the cruel acts that Deku was doing. As legit villains who were literally in the area where All For One had kept Deku will be screaming out in pain as their body would then be mutated into a weapon, as Deku would use it against All For One. As seen, this All For One then laughs as he would dodge out of the way of all of Deku's attacks before finally blasting him away with a ginormous wind blast. As Deku will be sent flying, he will soon be able to recover as he ends up flipping himself back up to gain back his balance as he turns back to All For One, only for All For One to then laugh as he tells Deku to listen. As all around, we would then hear people begin to make comments about Deku, saying how terrifying he was and how he just looked like a villain. As Deku would hear many people begin to mutter about him and over here just simply judging him, as All For One begins to pretty much tell Deku that this was his fate, that this was his so-called destiny, as Deku was always destined to be a villain. But you see, instead of falling to the taunts and everything like that, Deku instead just simply look at All For One before telling him to screw off. As Deku begins to go on a whole motivational speech in a very way that was not like him, as Deku tells everyone to judge him and do just simply what they always do, make assumptions about him without really getting to know him. As Deku begins to explain that as long as this was his quirk, that he was going to use the quirk as a way of using it to help people and to become a hero. And hearing this will cause everyone to fall silent as All For One then suddenly snorts, before laughing as he then finally ends up telling Deku that he was nothing more but a ginormous disappointment, as he then unleashes another blast at Deku, trying to send him flying once again. But you see, when this blast was approaching, time seems to slow down for Deku. His heart rate was going extremely fast, which was confusing to him since he kept it under control almost all the time. As Deku wonders what was going on, this is when he finally begins to actually feel complete freedom. Okay, see, Deku finally felt at this very moment that he didn't need to prove himself for nothing. That as long as he was here, he had complete control over everything. As Deku finally felt as if he was free from any stipulations or anything like that. As seeing this is when Deku then does something surprising, as this is when he then opens his mouth before saying the words, "Domain expansion." As just as when Deku finally finished saying those words, this is when suddenly multiple arms would then form, as they end up actually wrapping up around Deku, and not only that but also All For One, surrounding them in this black void. Now no one will be able to see nothing as they end up looking at the sphere in curiosity, as this is when the rest of the heroes would then arrive, all while All For One will be here inside this void in pure confusion. He looks around for a few moments before chuckling once again as he couldn't believe just how amazing Deku's quirk was, as he begins to make a comment saying just how much things he could do with it once it was his. But you see, unfortunately for All For One, he didn't know that it was already over. As he turns to Deku and begins commenting, saying that how he was going to enjoy like stealing away Deku's quirk once again, this is when Deku then tells him that it was over. As at this very moment, Deku felt as if he was in complete control, as if right now, All For One was literally at the palm of his hands. As All For One looks at Deku and finally stops talking, this is when he then tries to unleash one last attack, bringing everything he has into it so that way he can finish off Deku. Although while Deku, facing down the very powerful attack, he could do nothing more but actually thank All For One for this opportunity here. As Deku had once again felt inspired and not only that but also motivated to continue on with his goal, as he was going to be a hero no matter what people had said about his quirk. So thanks to this, he thanks All For One last time, as this is when he then finally activates his ability, transfiguring All For One beyond belief, as this will end up killing off All For One immediately, as his entire body will literally end up exploding, after transfiguring his soul way too abruptly. As just like that, it was done. Now All For One was completely killed off at that very moment, as this is when the domain would then collapse, as Deku was already feeling quite exhausted since this was his very first time using it. And when the domain collapsed, this is when finally the rest of the heroes would be there surrounding Deku and everything, as they would try to take witness about what just happened, only to be surprised, as legit there was nothing left of All For One, as the only signature that even showed that he was even there in the first place would be the fact that there was even a small bit of his suit still alive. As they all would end up looking at the scene with a shocked expression, this is when they turned their attention back to Deku, only to see him fall unconscious onto the ground as Deku was exhausted. As they all rush over to him to make sure that he was okay, the last thing they end up seeing would be the fact that Deku was actually smiling while under unconsciousness, as this is where we now do a time skip. Following the end of that day, we actually see crime go down quite drastically, as after the events that had transpired as well as the end of All For One being so gruesome, this caused many villains to go into hiding. And society was quite happy about this, except for the fact that they were quite upset about the fact that someone like Deku was a hero. But the thing is, they couldn't exactly, say that he was a bad one. Although his methods were quite cruel and now the time just, a perfect idealistic hero, he did what was needed to be done as necessary. And that caused Deku to gain the respect of people. And slowly over time, Deku does end up finishing his time at UA, he does eventually end up getting his hero license, and although Deku does faces many, and I mean many amounts of bias towards his quirk and everything, Deku was able to face it head on as he continues growing and becoming actually a very valuable member of the Hero Society. Okay, see, Deku was literally the best hero, the best healer after Recovery Girl stepped down, as thanks to Transfiguration, Deku was literally able to do what he exactly does, as he can either cause your death immediately or literally prevent it the best way he could, as Deku was literally able to heal up people in an instant by reverting their body back to normal. And although many people have their own thoughts and opinions on Deku, one thing was for certain, it was the fact that Deku was a hero. Although his methods could be quite cruel depending on which side you're on, Deku was someone who at the end of the day would fight for society with everything he's got. As now with that being said, we now turn to the final few moments of the story, as we see a couple of things end up playing out quite similarly. As the very first one will be the rescue of Eri, as thanks to the fact that Deku is there, they actually end up going by it with no casualties at all. That means that Night Eye does not die. And the main reason for this one is because of the fact that, well, literally Deku by now at this point in the story was literally the best healer that there was, even surpassing Recovery Girl, as he was able to literally modify the soul in order to pretty much return the person's body back to normal. Not only that, but Deku was also extremely strong, as legit any person that entered his range of transfiguration, they'll be done and one-shotted immediately. And if that's not the case, he can just simply end up influxing them with a generous amount of pain to knock them out, so that way they can question them for later. And that was not the only thing that actually ended up happening, as eventually over time, after many years, we actually see the end of All Might, as he eventually ends up stepping down from being the symbol of peace and goes into retirement. But you see, when All Might ends up stepping down, the next person in line would actually be none other than Deku. But you see, instead of actually accepting it, Deku declines this, as instead he believes that Mirio will be a much better choice. Because you see, while Mirio will be able to keep up the public image, being the shining ray of hope every single time there's darkness arise, Deku will be the one to do what's necessary. As every single time there will be a threat that needs to be eliminated, Deku will be the one to take care of it, as he was literally the strongest person around. And not only that, but if there's any person that had any life-threatening injuries or anything like that, Deku will be there to be able to save them. As thanks to this, we now turn to our very final moments of this what if. As you see, the very last thing we end up seeing is Deku pretty much taking that position, as he's the one maintaining society while being under the shadows. As he will be the nightmare that every villain feared. He will be Dr. Death, after all. The one that can cause you to continue on living, or the one who can make it all end in an instant. As this will be the end to what if Deku had Mahito's abilities. Thank you all so much for tuning into this what if. Hopefully you guys do enjoy. Sorry it took so long to upload this what if. It was just a simple fact that I was really studying a lot already because of the fact the exams are coming up, so I really need to prepare myself. And so yeah guys, I really hope you guys do enjoy this what if. You guys won't see me post in a while, but eventually I will end up returning. But I believe that's enough of this being said. So with that being said guys, it's your host Sage Sim right here, and he is signing off. So peace, have a lovely day, and stay safe out there y'all.